So this webinar, as I said, is part of the SRF365, which is a series of year-round free virtual programs that offer a taste of what you can expect at the annual Summit for Religious Freedom, also known as SRF, spelled SRF. SRF365 amplifies and supplements the annual summit's content and creates a year-round space for education, building power, networking, and taking action together. The summit is the hub for our collective fight for inclusive religious freedom, church-state separation, and the issues that depend on them, like LGBTQ plus rights, racial justice, reproductive rights, protecting democracy in public schools, and more. In collaboration with our partners, SRF is convened by Americans United, which is the only organization dedicated solely to defending this issue. Americans United is the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom without favor and equality without exception. The principles of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not for all. And finally, SRF is held both virtually and in person this year from April 5th through 7th in a new, larger venue. We've sold out the last 2 years, which is a great problem to have. It's just outside of Washington, D.C. There are scholarships available, and if you are a student with a .edu email address, you can register to attend virtually for free. All of those details and links are located at www.thesrf.org. That's the SRF.org, and we'll put that in the chat as well. Without further ado, let's dive in. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our moderator and panelist, Alessandro Terenzoni, Vice President of Policy here at Americans United, who will provide an overview of the key policy developments, threats, and opportunities before introducing our other panelists. Take it away, Alessandro.
Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. It's really just a huge pleasure to be here with this panel, who I'm going to introduce in just a little bit. I'm going to be honest and say that we're not going to talk that much about opportunities in this opening section. I'm going to leave that to my panelists. But before we really dive in, what I wanted to do was sort of acknowledge how scary this moment is, right? Tonight's panel is called Hope in Action, and I hope that all of us take away from this conversation some amount of hope, some action item that we can engage, something we can bring back to our communities. But I also want to acknowledge that being hopeful in this moment doesn't negate the very real fear and uncertainty and heartbreak being experienced by Americans across the country right now. It's heartbreaking what's happening, and I spend a lot of my time, and this is just me speaking, texting and talking with my friends who are concerned about their jobs because they're federal employees or because their work depends on federal funding. I spend a lot of time texting with my friends who have trans kids, who are dealing with hospitals that are complying in advance with directives not to provide life-saving care to their children. I spend a lot of my time texting with friends who are uncertain about their ability to stay in this country for a variety of reasons, and facing perhaps the possibility to have to leave on a moment's notice. These fears are very real, and I want us to be intentional in acknowledging them before we try to find some silver linings and think about what we can be hopeful for. So I think about the things that keep me grounded and hopeful these days. The first is reminding myself that the chaos is the point, right? I spoke to a group last night, and as I started, I asked for a show of hands to sort of, acknowledge who was feeling overwhelmed in this moment. Every single hand shot up. Indeed, one lady almost fell out of her chair. I think it is natural to feel this way right now. And I personally find it really helpful to remember that this is exactly what the people in power currently want from us. The cognitive overload is intentional. The sheer number of things that are happening day after day are such that they can't be kept up by the media, traditional or otherwise. And I don't know about you, but what I like to ground myself in is the fact that I don't want to give them what they want. So I refuse to be overwhelmed for too long. So when I go a little dark, which I'm sure is happening to many of us these days, I repeat to myself literally out loud. I do this multiple times per day. I say, they want me to be overwhelmed. And that in and of itself brings me back. because I don't intend to give them what they want. Second, I remind myself of our collective power. I feel that after the election, and maybe you heard it and read it too, there was a lot of discourse in the news and on social media about how this administration is better prepared this time. Um, this time is going to be different because they know what they're doing. And look, if you lived through the first Trump administration, there's kind of no way for them not to be better prepared, considering how unprepared they were. But I think it's also really, really important to remember that we are all better prepared as well. I think about Americans United and the work that we did leading up to the election. Before November 2024 ever hit, we had a plan for any eventuality, whether it was a Harris win or a Trump win. And I'm sure that the organizations represented here on this panel tonight are sort of in the same boat. This isn't our first rodeo. We understood what was coming. We've been preparing since before the election, and we're ready for this moment. And the last thing I want to sort of touch on in terms of finding hope, maybe it's not hope, maybe it's really about solace, for me has been being in community with my friends, with my neighbors, with my colleagues, with this group that's here on this webinar tonight, being with like-minded people who are actively trying to think how to meet this moment and who are taking actions that make us all a tiny bit safer and a little bit readier for what's coming. That gives me a ton of hope. So I just wanted to kind of set the scene on what we're trying to do here tonight, which is to discuss these issues and to be really clear-eyed about what we're facing, but to also bring in some modicum of calm, hope, and possibility. And it's funny that I just said that because now I'm going to dive into what's been happening. And look, it's not great. In the first few weeks of this administration, we've seen so many attacks, and they are attacks on the American people, right? So many that they're hard to count. And I am going to try to sort of highlight some of the lowlights of what's happening before we dive into our conversation with our panelists. So first, there were straight out the gate attacks on trans people. There was an executive order squarely focused on erasing trans and gender nonconforming people from American society. It purported to define things like male and female, and specifically noted that sex should not include the concept of gender identity. Notably, if you read that executive order closely, you may have missed a nod to the Christian nationalist goal of banning all abortions. Because in defining male and female, the executive order actually says that each is assigned at conception. So we are talking about personhood beginning at conception here, notably different from what's been in the rhetoric before. We've seen attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I use the words and not the acronym purposefully. I think that we need to move away from vilifying the acronym and letting people sort of hide behind it. Because what they're actually saying when they want to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion are just that, are those things. There was an executive order purporting to end illegal discrimination and restore, quote, merit-based opportunity. And here I want to note that I've noticed this administration leaning heavily on calling things illegal that aren't, or aren't yet, at least. These executive orders and the way they're couched are meant to start discourse and conversation, but they are not the law in and of themselves, and they can't change our laws by themselves. So please keep that in mind as we discuss this. There's an executive order calling for the end of radical indoctrination in our public schools. And recently, at her confirmation hearings, current Secretary of Education Linda McMahon told us, or I should say, left open the possibility that Black history courses could be an example of disallowed radical indoctrination. And this is just one of the many, many attacks on public education that we are seeing already in these early few weeks. Another executive order called for, and I quote, expanding educational freedom and opportunity. If you don't already know, phrases like this are just euphemisms for funneling public funds away from public schools and into private, mostly religious schools. This executive order specifically calls for a national voucher program, and this time it's a push for something called the Educational Choice for Children Act, or ECHA, in reconciliation, which is really, it's disguised as a tax credit, but it's going to amount to a $100 billion voucher program nationwide. Although we haven't seen it yet, and we are hearing rumors that we may see it as early as tomorrow, there is a plan and potentially an executive order calling for the abolishment or dismantling of the Department of Education. This is most recently evidenced by, indeed, Linda McMahon, again, sending a email to the entirety of the Department of Education's federal staff with the subject, "Our department's final mission," like they're going to the moon or something. Project 2025 called for this dismantling. It called for a bunch of what we're seeing. Indeed, it called for pretty much everything that we're seeing, as much as candidate Trump and other Republicans attempted to distance themselves from Project 2025. We are now seeing its implementation, the execution of a plan that was set, before we ever got here. Another thing that I sort of want to highlight and that I hope we can talk about a little bit is that in the dismantling of the Department of Education, Project 2025 also wants the administrative enforcement of our civil rights laws to essentially be ceased. Right now, the Department of Education houses, by statute, the Office for Civil Rights. Full disclosure, I was an attorney there for the beginning of my federal career before I moved to the Department of Justice before coming here. And under Project 2025, the functions of our administrative enforcement agencies, like the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, are meant to go to the Department of Justice, but to only be enforced through litigation. So that robust administrative enforcement that resulted from complaints filed by everyday people, like the folks on this panel and on this call today, is likely to go away in what is essentially a plan to divert our civil rights resources away from actual civil rights enforcement and to things like, eradicating anti-Christian bias. Another executive order called for that. It was interesting to me personally that so many of the executive orders talked about ending things, but when we got to anti-Christian bias, it was the eradication of it that sort of headlined the executive order. This is yet another executive order from this administration privileging certain religious beliefs among others. And it was issued in concert with another executive order establishing the White House Faith Office, which, was introduced as this new idea, but there's been faith-based offices out of the White House since George W. Bush. So this is hardly a new initiative. And of course, this focus on eradicating harms that are faced by no one else in this nation, but a subset of Christians, along with ending DEIA initiatives, are primarily to, divert these resources from robust civil rights law enforcement that we've had in the past. So I'm sure I've missed a ton because we all know that there's been so much. And I look to my panelists to help me fill in some of the blanks. But let's jump right into our conversation. First, I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone. Then we're going to get started with some questions. So first we have Rodrigo Heng Leitinen. Rodrigo is the executive director at Advocates for Trans Equality. He leads efforts to advance policies that protect transgender individuals at the federal and state level. With years of experience in advocacy and grassroots organizing, Rodrigo has been instrumental in shaping legislative strategies that counteract anti-trans policies. From the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, we have Antonio Ingram II. He's senior counsel at that organization and specializes in civil rights litigation, voting rights protections, and racial justice advocacy. His work focuses on dismantling systemic barriers in education, employment, and public institutions that disproportionately impact communities of color. And finally, we have Fish Stark from the American Humanist Association. Fish is the executive director of AHA and focuses on defending secular governance and countering religious nationalism in public policy. He's worked extensively on legal cases and grassroots initiatives that challenge faith-based discrimination in government programs and education. Thank you all so, so much for being with us tonight and engaging in, hopefully digging into the fear and the terribleness, but also finding some slivers of hope. So, Rodrigo, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk to us a little bit about how these executive orders that I mentioned and the other administrative changes that have happened in just the last 45 days are affecting trans rights right now on the ground?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you all so much for the invitation to be here and thank all of you for tuning in. It is an overwhelming world out there. As Alessandro mentioned, overwhelm is the strategy. That is a conscious, deliberate, strategic move on behalf of the opposition. But by tuning in tonight and by joining and taking action on some of the things that we'll fill you in on tonight, you're fighting that overwhelm. So really grateful for you all taking the time to be here with us tonight. Again, my name's Rodrigo Hangleighton, and I'm with Advocates for Trans Equality. So I'll give an overview of the executive orders attacking trans people so far. Unfortunately, I have to be honest here that there are so many of them that there's not really time to go into detail about all of them. I'm going to keep it high level, but I really invite anyone who has more detailed questions about the ramifications of any of these executive orders to put your question into the Q&A because we all of us panelists will have lots of Q&A time later in this webinar. There's roughly 5 executive orders that directly target trans people. Now, of course, there's many more executive orders that have a disproportionate harm on trans people as well as other marginalized people. But the ones that are explicitly about trans people, the ones that are consciously designed to put a target on trans people's backs, it's roughly 5 of them. One of them, and I'll go in no particular order. One is in healthcare. This is maybe the one that's gotten the most media attention. This is essentially a categorical ban on transgender patients under 19 years old being able to get any kind of transition-related healthcare. Now, really, it's an attempt at banning it because in reality, there's a lot of state level protections that actually mandate that this treatment has to be covered. And I can answer any questions about the interplay between federal and state here. It's quite complicated. But what's important to know is that this kind of healthcare has been studied for decades. It is recognized as essential primary care by every leading medical institutions. That includes the American Medical Association, American Psychological Association, and American Academy of Pediatrics. It is a long-studied scope of medicine, and that has resulted in strict age-appropriate guidelines. So whenever a young trans patient comes into a doctor's office with their parents and their families, there is a whole detailed protocol that medical professionals follow, and it's different whether the person is whether it's a 6-year-old child or a 16-year-old teenager. So there's really detailed age-appropriate guidelines that now the Trump administration is seeking to categorically throw into the garbage and instead impose a one-size-fits-all solution to a problem that doesn't exist. All of these medical decisions with young patients are always made with parents at the table. Now the Trump administration is trying to take that freedom away and mandating that even in families where the doctor is saying this is the treatment the child needs and the parents want that child to be able to access that care, the Trump administration is trying to make it illegal. But this is being challenged in the courts, and importantly, it's being blocked in the courts. There's been temporary restraining orders. Now, just a few days ago, there was a preliminary injunction. So it's really critical to know your rights, that if you are a parent of a young trans child or in any kind of situation where this affects you, know your rights. And the advocates for Trans Equality website has tons of resources. We also have an explainer about this executive order that will be sent as part of the follow-up email to this webinar. So we can give you a lot more information if you're in that situation. And now I'll go through the other executive orders faster just for the sake of time. Military ban. Trump, in his first administration, put a sweeping ban, kicked all trans people out of the military. And then Biden lifted that ban, and now Trump has put it back in. It's important to know that these are people who are in highly trained positions, and now they're being kicked out just because of who they are, even though they meet all of the other qualifications and the fitness requirements. There was also an executive order on the very first day of the Trump administration, January 20th, wasn't that long ago, if you can believe it, that essentially said, we don't recognize trans people. It was a statement from the White House essentially saying, if you're trans, we don't acknowledge that. Now, a lot of that is really communicating a worldview. It's not really enforceable. It's about fostering an environment of hostility. Concretely, though, one effect of it is it does mean that transgender people are now being blocked from updating our passports. So someone like me, who is a transgender man, would be issued a passport that says F for female, because that's what the letter that was stamped on my birth certificate when I was first born. So right now there is essentially an entire blockage of trans people being able to get accurate passports. And why passports? It's because the federal government is in charge of that. Other IDs like driver's licenses are states. So keep in mind, if you're trans, and you might still be able to get an accurate driver's license depending on where you live, but passports are essentially out of the question. Another concrete effect of this day one executive order against trans people is that now trans women, it mandates that transgender women who are behind bars, prison or jail, have to be put in a men's facility. This is incredibly dangerous. This is a recipe for violence and sexual assault. So that is also being challenged in the courts on those grounds that it creates an unsafe environment. And there have been the courts have been ruling in favor of these plaintiffs, which is great, saying that you cannot put someone who is behind bars in a situation where they will almost certainly be raped. So all of these things are being challenged in the courts, including the prisons. There was also Trump issued a sweeping ban on transgender girls playing school sports. So any young 13-year-old just trying to play volleyball with her friends is essentially no longer allowed to do so. Sports is a new area of a lot of people are new to the idea of a trans person playing school sports. So it's natural to have a lot of questions on this topic. What's good to remind ourselves of is reassuring is that sports is about learning a lot of lessons. When you're talking about a child playing school sports, it's about them learning values like teamwork, cooperation, discipline, hard work. It's about so much of your development of social skills. So to take that away from a child just because of who they are is really putting a target on their back. And trans kids have been coming out in school districts across the country for years before our existence was ever a political football. And this was always handled on a case-by-case basis by individual school districts and sports associations. So we'd really encourage a return to that. It's really a wild government overreach to have the federal government putting this sweeping categorical ban without any kind of nuance here for different kinds of athletes. And then lastly, very last executive order that squarely targeted us so far is about other parts of schools. So not just sports, but for example, it mandates that a teacher must forcibly out any LGBT student to their family with no exceptions for risk of abuse or being kicked out of the child being kicked out of their home. This is extremely dangerous. Most parents want what's best for their kids. Unfortunately, there are a few parents who are so opposed to someone being LGBT that they're willing to turn their back on their child just because the child is questioning or is trans or thinks they might be gay. And this really puts these kids in a dangerous position. Now, the way this really works is by threatening to pull funding. So a lot of these things, you know, the states may have more positive protective laws, which is good, and now the federal government is threatening to take their federal grant money if they don't comply with Trump's ideological position. And that's in practice how this would work. But I will close out by saying executive orders are not laws. Alessandro mentioned this earlier in this webinar, and I will repeat it. Executives are not laws. All of these are being challenged in the courts. We're having some good success with that. And there is a limit to how far they can go if Congress doesn't sign off. And I can talk later about what opportunities we have in Congress. But it's critical that we don't treat this as a done game when it's really not done at all yet. There is still a lot that we can and should do.
Thank you, Rodrigo. Antonio, I'm going to turn to you now. Can you talk to us about the biggest threats being faced by racial justice efforts, or sorry, at racial justice efforts and civil and voting rights? Can you kind of talk us through what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think right now we unfortunately have a two sort of battlefield front. On the one hand, we have a federal government that has become hostile to efforts to remediate historical discrimination, oftentimes through diversity, equity, inclusion policies. There have been a number of executive orders that have purported to ban so-called diversity, equity, inclusion. However, it's so broadly defined oftentimes that many organizations and institutions don't understand sort of how to comply with many of these executive orders. Unfortunately, they've already been, in many ways, enjoined in various parts by district courts at this point. But we also, I think, really have to be cognizant right now that we have a lot of state-based affronts to civil rights, especially in the educational space, in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion. You know, Alabama has passed a law that bans diversity, equity, inclusion in sort of kindergarten through graduate school. And in their law, they actually ban curriculum. And I'm representing a group of plaintiffs. And we have two professors who've already been threatened with termination for teaching so-called divisive concepts and diversity, equity, inclusion sort of related content, even though they have tenure. And I think we really need to not forget about many of the communities that were already under anti-civil rights sort of government systems before the Trump administration took place or took office in January, because as my colleague just mentioned, executive orders sort of dissipate, fortunately, if there's a change in administration. But many of these laws in places like Texas and Alabama and South Carolina, they will endure through various administrative changes, depending on the future of the federal government. And so I think we also need to be aware that there's both federal and state sort of confrontations that are taking place in this moment. And they're both really important, especially because diversity, equity, inclusion has become such a boogeyman that it becomes, a Black graduation ceremony. It becomes a queer affinity group. It really becomes anything that's not within a sort of very heteronormative white cultural framework. And we see a lot of communities right now facing defunding of organizations and defunding of spaces if you happen to be Black or queer or Latinx or a woman. And we also have to remember in this moment that many of these battles happen because of the summer of George Floyd and the sort of racial awakening that our country had and sort of a newfound awareness of sort of narratives that the Black community has been talking about for generations and if not centuries. And I think many of the things we're seeing get challenged or remediations for those sorts of disparities. And so I think we have to really be cognizant that this current backlash is because of a sort of modicum of success. And this backlash is because there have been many initiatives and efforts to really help create more belonging for communities that have been excluded, both by law and social norms and policies historically in our country. And we have to remember that as we fight against this current administration and their efforts to make us have regression in terms of racial justice, we can't sort of neglect that we have states that are still also under these sort of more draconian anti-civil rights administrations at their local levels. And so we have to have a multi-pronged impact to really ensure that all communities are protected and have their civil rights uplifted and enshrined in our U.S. Constitution and our state level as well. And I'll pause there and happy to answer Q&A later on.
Thank you, Antonio. Fish, I'd like to ask you, what are the legal and policy battles that we should be paying attention to regarding religious encroachment on government and our rights?
It's a great question, Alessandro, because ultimately Donald Trump has decided that he's going to declare all-out war on the American ideal of religious pluralism. Right? We have gone from George Washington saying in his Newport letter that the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance, and requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support, to Donald Trump saying, we're going to make religion a much more important factor. And we're going to bring religion back in a big way. And we don't believe you can be happy without religion. Trump has gone from the principles of the founders to arguing for a state of religious supremacy. And, you laid it out, Alessandro. He is doing it really clearly, not just with this sham task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias, which is really a shill for Christian supremacist organizations and goals and designed to chill speech against Christian nationalism, or with the White House Faith Office, which has been a tool of commingling church and state going back multiple Republican presidents. We're concerned, as you are, about the efforts through school voucher programs to radically shift billions of taxpayer dollars to right-wing religious institutions under the guise of educational choice for parents. And, unfortunately, a big domino in this fell with appointing wrestling executive Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education, who full-throatedly supported Trump's voucher scheme and framed it, I think, very disingenuously as about allowing parents to direct the moral education of their children. Truth is that if you support prayer in schools and you support posting the 10 Commandments in schools, you don't support parents being able to direct the moral education of their children. You support pushing right-wing Christianity on kids and calling it freedom. And so ultimately, I think our biggest battles are going to be around schools, because that's where a huge amount of wealth transfer is going to happen. It's what the Christian nationalists are eager to see, because it not only furthers their goals to try and build generations of young people who think like them through indoctrination, but it also puts money right in their pocket. And we're going to have to pay attention to this eradicating anti-Christian bias task force, because as you just saw today, Trump is using the sort of specter of anti-Semitic college protests to have his little trial balloon for how he's going to crack down on protected speech and protests. We should be very clear that secular people could very well be the next target after they decide that they're going to deport and arrest and expel pro-Palestinian protesters. But here's what we do know. Lobbying works, litigation works, and slowing things down works. So just a couple months ago, we won a really important victory from a judge that was appointed by George W. Bush in a court case against the city of Ocala, Florida, which tried to host a city-sponsored prayer vigil. So there are Republican judges who are willing to hold the line and say, no, it's not the government's job to endorse or religion or create a climate of Christian supremacy. That's why we're rebuilding our legal center at the AHA to be able to tackle more cases on the basis of civil rights law to ensure that secular people aren't discriminated against. But we're also going to be working on, again, preventing school voucher programs. And by the way, one of the things that we all need to pay attention to in an area where we can get some quick wins fast is that these school voucher programs that put our public dollars into religious schools are not simply a creation of right-wing Trumpers and blue states. My state of Maryland, which voted for Kamala Harris by about 65%, sends $8.5 million a year to largely upper middle class parents to fund their kids to go to private religious school. So if you live in a blue state, it's very possible that there's a school voucher program near you funding the exact same goals of the right-wing religious nationalists in Oklahoma that you can write your legislator about and try to, goodness knows blue states are going to be looking for things to cut, knowing the pain that's about to come down from the federal government. So the vouchers and targeting the attempts to really break down the secular foundations of public schools is an important area. Paying attention to the way Trump administration is going to chill speech is important. And it's important that we use all the legal tools at our disposal. One of the things that we're focused on, and one of the reasons for hope, is that there's a really strong base of members of Congress that are coming together, standing up to support separation of church and state. It's called the Congressional Free Thought Caucus, and the AHA has been helping to organize it for almost a decade now. We've seen 3 new members of Congress join just in this year. So it's a record expansion. We've got over 24 members. We're really proud that Congresswoman Laura Friedman, Congresswoman Andrea Salinas, and Congresswoman Emily Randall have just joined. So in the wake of these attacks on religion and Trump trying to say that religion is inherent to the character of the United States rather than religious pluralism and freedom, we've seen people come together in a big way. We've seen even Republicans and Republican appointed judges be willing to push back against these excesses. And ultimately, we've seen voters reject some of the worst excesses of this movement, right? You can see it in Kentucky, where voters voted for Trump by a great margin, but they rejected a statewide ballot initiative about a voucher scheme that, again, would have sent billions of Kentucky taxpayer dollars to religious schools. So those are the fights where I would look on the horizon. Are we building our bench of advocates for church-state separation? Are we mobilizing parents to fight back about these voucher schemes, which don't give choice to anyone except upper-income parents and don't improve the quality of schools? And are we paying attention to what Trump is trying to do to chill the speech of people who complain about his, destruction of religious freedom by branding them as anti-Christian?
Thank you, Fish. So I'm looking at the time and I see we're at 11 after, and I'm seeing some questions. So we're going to ask some questions, but they're going to be the audience questions, kind of tied into some of the things that I've heard. One of the themes is this misrepresentation that's going on, right? And misrepresentation is a nice word for lying, whether it's lying about what DEI initiatives actually do, or what, the number of trans athletes that are out there. If you've listened to Senator Tuberville, it's only trans girls playing sports in high schools these days. Or these misrepresentations about Christianity and its place in the founding of this nation, which we know isn't true. I'm also seeing a request for action. So I'm going to ask each of you, and let's start with Antonio, for an action item on undoing those misrepresentations, on undoing the lies that are being spread and that are undergirding what we're seeing right now.
Thank you. So I think for me, one important way to really combat the disinformation and misinformation in this current moment is to really talk about why did we have to have diversity, equity, inclusion policies in the first place? And I think when you look at the executive orders and the state laws that have been passed in the past few years, there's sort of this amnesia, this forced forgetting that they're predicated on. The disparities that we see in K through 12 and in higher education were not sort of primordial. They were not organic. They did not just arise in a void. They came because of state-sanctioned discrimination. They came because there were people of color, there were women, there were queer people who were excluded from spaces because of laws and policies. I think about, I went to Yale for undergrad. Yale did not let women in until 1970. And we need to talk about that. It's not like we have this amazing, multiracial community that had all these, different genders and orientations that lived in harmony. And then, we're now trying to create, this false sort of meritocracy. It was never a meritocracy. It was never sort of an equal playing field that we all had equal access to access resources and institutions. And so I think we need to talk about that history. We need to talk about why we're in this current moment. Because if you acknowledge those disparities and you acknowledge the root of those disparities, it then leads to like a logical place of advocacy. If the government and our society created these gaps in resources and in access, then they have to remediate those gaps, right? It's only fair. And I think diversity, equity, inclusion is no longer oftentimes talked about in these terms about remediation. It's talked about, oh, we're giving people undue benefits or undue preferences, but those preferences would not have to exist but for undue exclusion and undue discrimination that happened, in recent memory. I think about my case in Alabama right now, where they're trying to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion. Alabama did not integrate their sororities for Black women until 2013. And so to now have a state say, oh, no, we're done. We can ban diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're all this like kumbaya sort of multiracial community now is a lie. And I think the lie of colorblindness only gets dispelled when you speak about what is true. And so I think for me, one thing that's helpful in this current moment is to unveil the lies that people are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to really say, these are not handouts. These are reparations, and it's restitution for past discrimination. And we should not be ashamed of these programs. We should not view them to be illegal. And I think one thing, for example, that's been really helpful I've seen, there's a Dear Colleague letter that the Department of Education released on Valentine's Day. And it misrepresented the affirmative action case. And it said that because of the Harvard SFFA case, that race-conscious programs such as a Black graduation or even a queer affinity group are suspect and should be deemed unconstitutional. And they've walked back a little bit of that in recent guidance that's come out this week. But I think part of why that happened is because advocates and universities said, you're lying. Like, this is not what that case was about. This case was about race-conscious admissions. It was a very narrow set of facts. And so I think the current battle, right, is yes, there's an administration that is not always responsive to the needs of Black communities, the communities of color and queer communities. But when we all work in unison and we call out their lies, I have seen there be sort of backpedaling in a way that is helpful for advocacy. So I say, keep speaking up and keep saying what you know to be true in these moments.
Thank you. Rodrigo, do you want to jump in? Sort of on the
Sure,
same
I've got
question.
5 things, trying to be super concrete. So everyone get pen and paper. Number 1, testify in your state legislature and your city council. A lot of people don't realize that in most states, not all, so sorry if you live in Oklahoma, this doesn't apply to you, but in most states, when there is a bill in a state legislature, there has to be a hearing. And anyone who lives there can show up and testify. If you live far away from your state capital, you might be able to submit your testimony virtually, which is basically like emailing it. It might be uploading it in a portal. But this is a tremendous opportunity to make your voice heard. We all get those action alerts where you click a link and send an email to your representative, and that is good. Testifying is the next level of it. Not a lot of people bother to show up to testify. So when you do, and when people from our side do, it has a really strong impact. This is the really effective strategy. And we created this guide at Advocates for Trans Equality about how to testify. Thank you, David, for putting it in the chat. So we wrote this guide about trans rights. We hope you'll support trans rights on this, but you could also modify the basic ideas for any topic. It's really bread and butter stuff about just saying, hey, I live here, I'm a constituent, I'm a voter, if that applies to you, and here's why I care about this. So definitely go testify in your city council, school board, state legislatures. Second thing is submit public comment on regulations. This is maybe the dorkiest thing in the world, but it's really effective. So in the category of things people don't realize about how our democracy works, is also when a federal agency like HHS or HUD or VA, all these letters that we hear, all these abbreviations, when they make a regulation, they usually have to open it up to public comment. And most people don't bother to submit a comment, but they are required by federal law to read every comment. So we advocates for trans equality had a lot of success under the first Trump administration in slowing regulations down because we submitted so many comments that they couldn't the bad guys couldn't put these bad policies into effect for several years. And in one case, we slowed the clock down so much the policy never went into effect. So submit public comments. It's a really underused strategy. If you sign up for Advocates for Trans Equality's email list, A4TE's email list, we'll send you alerts about trans regulations. And I'm sure many of our partner organizations on this webinar tonight do it on other topics as well. Number 3, call your Congress people, not just email, call them, old fashioned, pick up the telephone, dial a number, call them, leave a voicemail. Most congressional offices keep a tally of the phone calls they get, and they pay a lot of attention to that. We just scored a big victory on trans rights the day before yesterday, where we managed to we got so many phone calls in to Democrat senators that we held the line, and not a single Democratic senator caved and voted against trans people on a sports bill. This was huge. So calling your Congress people really works. At A4T, we're also going to host a lobby day later here in Washington, D.C. So you can sign up for our email list and we'll let you know about that. Number 4, train yourselves up on basic community organizing skills. This is a critical time to go back to the bread and butter tactics of base building and mobilization. At A4T, we're starting a monthly volunteer event where you can get trained up. Just next week, we have one about community fundraising. So sign up for that. And then the last thing, most ambitious, but very impactful, run for office yourself. These jerks are not the only people who can hold elected office. We can do it too. There's tons of races on the local level that go uncontested every election cycle, meaning no one bothers to file to run against the incumbent, the person who has a position. So run for office. You do not have to be a genius to be an elected official. This can be a lot more accessible than you may think. And we have a form at Advocates for Trans Equality you can fill out if you're in favor of transgender rights and you're thinking of running, and we will help you out. So testify, submit public comments, call your Congress people, get trained up, and run for office. Those are my things.
I love that, Rodrigo. Fish, in answering the same question, I also want to draw your attention to a question in the chat, which is, how do we convince people that voting for him, meaning Trump, works against freedom from religion or freedom of religion? And you also kind of weave that into your answer.
That's a great question. First of all, Antonio Yaley to Yaley, what up? Go Bulldogs. I think I just want to draw attention to everything Rodrigo said. Like, we have so much more power and voice than we think we do. They would like us to think that we do not. There are plenty of people running their mouths on Twitter saying the calling isn't working, the emailing isn't working, but it is. It is slowing the things down that they want to happen, and ultimately delaying is victory. We were able to stop so many things in the first Trump administration from happening because we slowed down the process, gummed down the works, and individual voices matter in that. It was humanist hero Frederick Douglass said, liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceases to exist, because that of all rights is the dread of tyrants. That's why it's the right which they first strike down, because they know its power. So the more we're talking, the better we're going to see results. And there was a great article, I'll put it in the chat in a sec, called by Harvard professor Theda Skocpol in the New Republic, that looked at what worked in the first Trump administration. It wasn't big lawsuits or big rallies. Like, yeah, those things mattered. They didn't backfire. But what really moved the needle was the 2,000 or 3,000 resistance groups, local groups, organized by volunteers in cities and towns across America, where people were sharing information about what was happening, how to resist and fight back, and bringing it in to their personal conversations and letting people know what happened. Ultimately, I think Sure, we can make the case that Donald Trump is undermining religious freedom, but the even bigger thing that we've got to make clear is that Donald Trump is not helping working people. People voted for change in this election because prices were too high at the grocery store, at the gas station, when you're buying a house, and Donald Trump is doing everything but trying to bring prices down for working Americans. He's trying to, institute a national religion. He's trying to pick on trans kids in athletics, and he's trying to get rid of DEI, whatever that means to him, and he's not actually doing anything to help working people but giving tax cuts to his billionaire buddies. I think that's the number one thing that people need to hear, not just Donald Trump is focused on dismantling the freedom of religion, but also what he's not focused on, and that this isn't what people voted for. When it comes to talking about freedom of religion, I think the best thing that one of the things we can do with our voices when talking about these things is using examples of the founders to undercut the idea that this is a Christian nation, right? I talked about Washington's Newport letter earlier. There's also the Treaty of Tripoli that Washington signed that says right there in black and white in the 1790s, the United States is in no sense a Christian nation, right? This was back in the first term. We were signing documents that said that. Trump can try to rewrite history, but the thing about history is it already happened. So he's got a little bit of a roadblock to overcome there. One of the strongest things that I think is an argument against Trump's idea of religious freedom, and a great way to undermine another right-wing talking point, the right loves to seize on this idea of parents' rights. That's a big part of their that's a tip of the spear in their education attack, and they try to talk about it with trans issues. Parents' rights. Parents have the right to do this, the right to do that, the right to direct the education of their kids. And I think it's incumbent upon us to ask, where are parents' rights when Christianity is being pushed in public schools? In what sense is it pro-parents' rights for me to send my kid to a public school and someone else to push their religion on my kid with my tax dollars? I don't think anyone voted for that. I literally think maybe 5% of America is interested in their tax dollars being used to push a specific version of right-wing Christianity onto the children of people who don't believe it, no matter what they practice at home. And I think it's a great example of undermining religious freedom. We don't live in a religiously free country when there are states in some, or schools in some states, that promote one version of Christian doctrine as true, despite the fact that people of all faiths and none have kids in those schools, and their rights as parents to direct the religious education of their kid are being undermined and superseded. That's not religious freedom. Those aren't the actions of someone who wants to protect real religious pluralism in America, and it's an affront to what the founders intended.
Thank you, Fish. And in Fish's comments, I heard a little bit of something that I'm seeing in the questions and answers. And I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions since it is 8:26. But I want to raise up the very real destabilization that Sarah mentioned in her question. That's going to happen when people in America start losing things like Medicaid and SNAP. And it really goes to the priorities of this administration, right? To what we're funding instead of these life-saving programs. And what we're funding are tax breaks for the very richest among us. So I didn't want to let that go unsaid. But given the time, I think what I'd like to do is just go around one more time, let everybody kind of give your final thought on this, on this moment. What keeps you going? What's the one thing that kind of keeps you in the fight, that keeps you thinking about your community, and keeps you showing up every day? How about, excuse me, let's start with you, Fish.
One of the things as humanists is that we believe in human potential. We believe there's no problem people can't solve and no truth we can't uncover as long as we live in societies that protect the right to think freely. We're secular people. We believe nothing's coming to save us, but that also means nothing ever has, and we're still here. We evolved from fish and built civilizations, and that is a miracle. We can beat Trump. I have no doubt in my mind that that is possible. That's what's keeping us going through. The other thing that's keeping me going through, we know, like, what we focus on grows. The AHA, yeah, we are fighting Trump's policies. We are also in blue states pushing for pro-secular policies, things like healthcare sharing ministry transparency, so religions can't push fake healthcare coverage on consumers and scam them and get away with it by calling it faith-based. So sign up for American Humanist for our emails at AmericanHumanist.org to hear how you can fight back, how you can push forward good policy, but also just some good inspiration from humanist leaders about why we have reason to believe in people right now, even as we see people doing really terrible things.
Rodrigo.
What gives me hope is that trans people have always been going through hard times. I mean, let's be real. It's not like when Biden was in office, everything was rainbows and butterflies either, right? I mean, trans people, our whole history is that of overcoming the odds. And we word when the government did not recognize us before either. This is not our first rodeo. But I draw a lot of inspiration from the fact that we are all still getting up in the morning and finding a way through it. To what Fitch said about we have more power than we often realize. I mean, in the very same on the very same election night that Trump unfortunately won the presidency, there was also the very first openly trans woman elected in Kentucky. In Kentucky, not exactly a bastion of transgender acceptance, right? And an openly trans woman won by a wide margin. And at A4TE, we've been tracking record numbers of people signing up to run for office this year now. So, we know how to do this. Yeah, it's hard. There's no denying it. But the history of activism is always that of overcoming long odds. So I draw a lot of inspiration from that history.
Thank you. Antonio.
Yes, I think for me, I really think about many of the Black civil rights leaders. It was a little bit of a different perspective. They did have religion, they did have Christianity that motivated them to resist white supremacy and resist people who try to dehumanize them. And I think for me, I follow that tradition. Many of my clients who I get courage from are churchgoers, and they do sort of have an internal sense of hope that is grounded in something that's transcendent. And I think you have to have that in that moment when you have your government yet again trying to make you regress to really, in some ways, reinstitute segregation. But I also think that's the key word, reinstitute. The fact that we are here right now means we have one in many ways. The fact that I could go to a place like Yale, the fact that I can work at Legal Defense Fund, that was not the reality of African Americans 50 years ago. And I think we have to recognize the progress that we're at and let that be the vantage point from our advocacy, that they would not be trying to marginalize us if we were not successful. They would not be trying to send us back if we had not arrived. And so for me, it's in this moment of backlash that we have to remember that we're here because some things have gone well, and that our ancestors done it before, and we will continue to fight and do it again.
Love it. So what gives me hope is that all of you are doing the work that you're doing, and your organizations are doing the work that you're doing. In the Q&A, there were lots of questions about you and your organizations. Please look these folks up, look up their organizations, follow them on social media. Go to au.org and thesrf.org to learn more about Americans United. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. This was a really helpful conversation for me personally, and I hope it was a helpful conversation for everyone joining us tonight. I'm going to pass it back to Brian to close us out.
All right. Yes, again, thank you to all of our panelists, Rodrigo for Advocates for Trans Equality, Fish from American Humanist Association, Antonio from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and Alessandro from Americans United, and your organizations for their support. A reminder, this webinar was recorded, and if you registered, you'll receive an email tomorrow with the link to the recording, as well as all of the resources that were posted in the chat. If you like what you heard, I hope that you'll join us at our next SRF365 webinar, which will be in the summer. But consider before then joining us in person or virtually at the 2025 Summit for Religious Freedom next month, April 5th through 7th, both virtually and just outside of Washington, D.C. Visit www.thesrf.org for more information and to register. And a reminder, if you're a student with a .edu address, registration is free. Again, thank you to our panelists, our audience, and everyone who made tonight possible. Have a great night.